Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on Assassin's Creed 2, 10 years after its initial release. And it is really strange to think that this game is officially 10 years old. But AC2 is such an influential game in my life, and while I do still love the game from a narrative perspective, and it still remains one of the best narratives in the entire Assassin's Creed series, I feel like some of its gameplay just doesn't hold up at this point, and some other elements of the game were just never that great to begin with. So while it is a very nostalgic game for me, it's not one where I overlook its flaws. Well, let's start by talking about my experience with this game. I first got into Assassin's Creed around the release of this game. I ended up picking up Assassin's Creed 1, and I fell in love with it. I really love almost everything about it. I love the parkour system. I love the history. I love the sci-fi elements that were also there. It's really a perfect narrative for me. It's really like everything I like in narratives mixed into one thing. And I just played the game over and over and over again. And months down the road, eventually, on my birthday, my parents bought me AC2, and as sad as it might sound, it completely changed the way I look at the world. Whether that's for the better or for the worse, I feel like ever since playing AC2 for the first time, like over 9 years ago now, I've become a much more analytical person, a person who is quite frankly pretty cynical. A lot of that had to do with the way that ideologies were portrayed within the Assassin's Creed series that made me really think about the world a lot more in depth. So because of that, Assassin's Creed 2 always hold a special place in my heart. But I remember at the time, when I was about to first play Assassin's Creed 2, I was a bit worried. Again, I loved Assassin's Creed 1 so much. I know that all the reviews were saying, oh, AC2 is better than it in every single way, but again, I just loved Altair so much. I loved almost everything about Assassin's Creed 1 outside of its mission structure, that I just didn't think that AC2 would surpass it, and it did in almost every possible way. So let's start talking about the game itself. Let's start off with its setting, the Italian Renaissance, which I think was a perfect setting for this sequel. AC1 obviously took place in the Crusades. It's a very dark, depressing, cold setting. Obviously the Renaissance here is more jovial, more lively, and you also see a lot of that through the tone of the narrative. The open world is kind of a mixed bag for me. It's constructed like many other open world games from that time, where instead of one massive world, it's a lot of smaller maps that are connected like a line. And some of these maps are good, some of them aren't. Tuscany is mostly just empty fields, but there is a town in the center, and really, it's just average. It's alright, though notoriety becomes really a pain in this area. Montergioni is really nostalgic to me, and there's surprisingly a lot of stuff to do there. You can collect the statues, you could do renovations. It's just a fun place to be in, even though it's extremely small. But so many important narrative beats happen there. And obviously it's a major setting in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood as well. Florence is probably my favorite city in the game, and probably one of my favorites in the franchise as well. It's fun going from rooftop to rooftop, and the city really feels built for that style of gameplay, which I do feel eventually gets lost in Assassin's Creed somewhere down the road. The mountains is, it's a set piece. It's nothing really. It's really just there for one specific mission, but it does remain in the open world, so yeah. It's kind of pointless. I never cared for Forli. The city itself is fine. It's like your typical average city, but everything outside of it is just so swampy and depressing, and also just kind of annoying to navigate through. Might need the Ezio Collection Remaster did brighten up this area a bit, but still not my favorite location. But speaking of difficult to navigate through, we have Venice, and Venice sucks. The thing about it is that obviously aesthetically and in terms of being an iconic city, obviously Venice is that, but the number of canals in this area make the city a real pain to navigate through. When you're running on ground level, there's multiple dead ends or sections that lead to places that you don't really intend on. It's such a pain to go through. It's really just one of my least favorite locations to play in any Assassin's Creed game. But now let's talk about the gameplay. I think the base gameplay really hasn't aged well. To be honest, I think probably has aged the worst out of any Assassin's Creed game. I think even Assassin's Creed 1 has at least a stronger combat system. And I feel like Brotherhood really improves the combat system of AC2, but the AC2 base gameplay is just kind of clunky. The parkour is really clunky at points, especially before you get the climb leap. But I will say, I do have a lot of nostalgia for the old school controls here, where each of the face button represents a part of the character's body. And I was disappointed where they got rid of this in Revelations. As I mentioned, the climb leap really does improve things, but again, you don't get it until the halfway point. So climbing does get very frustrating during that first half of the game. Combat is really slow as you spend most of your time waiting for your enemies to attack so that you can counter them. And the use of light and heavy attacks that was prevalent in AC1 was taken out, so I do feel like the combat system was a bit of a downgrade here and really just one of the worst in the entire series. The mission structure is something I didn't love at the time because of the abundance of long tailing and escorting missions, and I still dislike these types of missions now. I mean, that being said, I do think the first half of the game is mostly void of these types of missions and is better for it. But the back half of the game becomes a slog of just terrible missions. I mean, Sequence 7 is one of the worst sequences in the entire franchise, being filled with escorting missions and killing of random guards. Sequence 9 has some of the dumbest missions I've ever played, with the Carnivale minigames being really poorly designed, especially the Catch the Flag minigame, where the best strategy there is to run off the roof, almost killing yourself, grab the flag, and climb back up. And then you have to do this 3 times. And what's even worse, too, is that you're forced to play the DLCs if you have them installed, as they completely break up the pace of the game. It's so strange because Sequence 11 really sets off at a point where it's like, okay, now we're going to take down Rodrigo Borgia. Like, this is going to be the end of the game, but then it's like, nope, you have 2 sequences to play in between then, and then you get to the end of the game. And even then, you have to get the codex pages and all that stuff. It's really just not a fun section of the game. Especially because, in my opinion, Balfour Lee is relatively boring. I never particularly liked Balfour Lee. And Balfour of the Vanities, while fun, it is pretty long, with a long string of assassination missions. And obviously there are 30 codex pages to collect, so by the time you get around to fighting Rodrigo Borgia at the end of the game, it feels so long since you've actually been playing the main story. And I never got how the DLCs were actually supposed to be part of the main game, because they were supposed to be part of the main game. They were just content that wasn't able to be finished before the game's intended release. But because of that, they took them out and released them later, and again, I just don't get it, because it just ruins the game. Like, I don't get what they were thinking there. Now let's talk about the side content in the game. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there's some really boring, monotonous quests, like the races, the beat-em-up events, the assassination contracts. Collecting feathers can be a big pain, considering there's no in-game map for them, at least not a free one. But there was some other really good content. I really love the renovation system. Obviously, it's not as refined as it will be in Brotherhood, but it is fine here. The Subject 16 glyphs really expanded the lore and set up a really interesting storyline with Subject 16 that never lived up to its potential, but they were a great inclusion in this game. The best piece of side content here are the tombs, which are just really fun platforming sections, and probably some of the best missions in the entire game, which do lead to you getting the Armor of Altair, which is probably my favorite outfit in the entire series, and definitely the best outfit in this game. Now, from a narrative perspective, which I do still think this is one of the best narratives in the entire series, being a perfect display of character development following Ezio over the course of, over 20 years, showing the change from a young, privileged Florentine noble into a skilled master assassin. And this also serves as the foundation of what would make Ezio one of the best characters, if not the best character in the entire series. But while I do feel like Ezio is a strong character here, I do think other characters get better first games. I do think, like, there's a debate for Bayek and Edward. So it's really Ezio's next 2 appearances that really make him stand out for me. But considering how radically different he was from Altair, he was definitely a breath of fresh air. The side characters here were also much stronger than AC1 as well, with some pretty iconic characters to the series like Leonardo and Mario and Claudia, Machiavelli, Caterina. So many great characters here. The villains, for the most part, were fine. I mean, the real one that stands out for me are, well, I mean, I guess Vieri is probably one of the better ones, but also Rodrigo. I think Rodrigo, probably one of the better main antagonists in the entire series. One thing I remember being mind blown about at the time, though, was the reveal of the first Civ. I mean, I remember the fight with Rodrigo at the end, where I was just riveted with what he was saying, talking about how God lies within the vault. And we finally enter the vault, and we see this projection of Minerva talking about the end of the world, and talking directly to Desmond. I mean, I really just love this twist here, and it was just such a great new wrinkle to this narrative It really kept me with the Assassin's Creed franchise for as long as I was. From a modern day perspective, I think this game does a really good job at progressing the mysterious tone that came from Assassin's Creed 1 while expanding its overall lore with the glyphs and the introduction of the Isu, while also connecting itself to the Ancestor storyline by having Desmond being trained by the bleeding effect. We do also meet Sean and Rebecca, who are two of the better characters from the modern day. I also find it really impressive that they included the section of Altair where you chase down Maria in Acre, as that's something that they wouldn't care enough to do nowadays. I guess the final thing I want to talk about here is Patrice Monceau. I mean, the creative director of Assassin's Creed 1 and 2. Obviously, I didn't notice this at the time, but I do feel like he was such a massive reason of why I fell in love with the franchise. While he was there, the games had purpose, they had a direction, they had a plan, and you could see that throughout Brotherhood as well. That was the final game he worked on. But after Brotherhood, and especially after AC3, you could tell Ubisoft had no clue what they were doing with this franchise. A lot of its potential within the overall narrative that they had was just completely dropped pretty much. A lot of storylines that started within this game and Brotherhood are completely dropped, are never picked up on again, or if they are, they're done so in a way that's very blatantly not what was initially intended. But I've said this before and I stick to this now, that I do wish Patrice got his vision. I do wish that the series ended with Assassin's Creed 3. But obviously Ubisoft wanted money and that's not really what we got. And because of that, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But overall, I mean, AC2 is a really nostalgic game for me, and playing it for the first time was one of the best experiences I've ever had with a game. But when taking out the nostalgia, I mean, the gameplay really hasn't aged well, even comparing it to even Brotherhood, which was a massive improvement in almost every possible way gameplay-wise, in my opinion. But with the narrative and the modern day of AC2, it still remains a pretty strong game and is one of the main reasons to play the game nowadays. So that's everything I gotta say about AC2 10 years later. Thank you for watching.